In the quiet town of Oakwood, where pristine lawns and stately homes masked the secrets behind closed doors, a forbidden affair began, one that would spiral into an all-consuming obsession and, ultimately, murder. At the heart of this chilling tale is Susan Carmichael, a stepmother whose infatuation with her stepson, Ryan, would unravel her life and the lives of those around her. The Carmichael family lived in an elegant two-story colonial home at the end of a tree-lined street. From the outside, they were the picture of suburban peace. But beneath the surface, a dark and dangerous desire had taken root. It all began with Ryan's unexpected return to Oakwood, bringing with him an intensity that Susan had not anticipated. Ryan, Alan's son from his first marriage, had been away for years, living with his biological mother in the city until her sudden death. Now, in his mid-20s and fresh out of college, Ryan returned to Oakwood with an intensity that Susan had not anticipated. He had grown into a handsome young man, tall and lean, with striking eyes that seemed to bore into anyone who crossed his path. Susan had noticed it immediately. At first, she had tried to dismiss the feelings that stirred inside her. After all, Ryan was her stepson. She had watched him grow from a moody teenager into the man sitting across from her now. But something was different this time. His presence felt electrifying, dangerous even. There was a quiet tension between them that Susan couldn't explain, or didn't want to. She tried to convince herself that it was nothing more than fascination, a passing feeling that would soon fade. But as the days turned into weeks, Susan found herself thinking about Ryan more often than she cared to admit. Every time he walked into the room, she felt her pulse quicken, her mind racing with thoughts she knew she shouldn't have. It was wrong, so wrong, but she couldn't stop herself. And soon, those innocent thoughts turned into something much darker. One summer evening, while Alan was away on yet another business trip, the tension between Susan and Ryan reached its breaking point. The house was quiet, save for the gentle hum of the air conditioning and the occasional clink of dishes in the sink. Susan could feel Ryan's presence behind her as she washed up after dinner, his eyes burning into her back. Her hands trembled slightly as she scrubbed the plates, the air between them thick with unspoken desire. She had been avoiding him all evening, trying desperately to keep her emotions in check. But it was no use. He was always there, lingering in the corners of her mind, consuming her every thought. "Do you ever wonder what it would be like?" Ryan's voice broke the silence, low and measured, sending a shiver down Susan's spine. Her heart raced as she turned off the water and slowly wiped her hands on a dish towel. She didn't need to ask what he meant. She had been wondering the same thing. "What are you talking about?" she asked, though her voice was barely above a whisper. Ryan stepped closer, his presence overwhelming, suffocating. "You and me," he said, his tone even. "Do you ever wonder what it would be like if we weren't who we are?" Susan's breath caught in her throat, her mind spinning. She could feel the blood rushing in her ears, her pulse thundering in her chest. She should have stopped it right then and there and walked away before it was too late. But instead, she found herself stepping closer, her body betraying every rational thought in her mind. I can't," she stammered, but her words were weak, unconvincing. "Why not?" Ryan asked, his voice soft, yet insistent. "No one has to know. It can be our secret." His words sent a thrill through her that she couldn't deny. She had always been the perfect wife, the perfect homemaker, the perfect everything. But now, for the first time in her life, she wanted something she knew she shouldn't have, something dangerous, something that only Ryan could give her. Before she knew what she was doing, Susan closed the distance between them, her lips crashing into his with a ferocity that shocked her. It wasn't a gentle kiss, it was wild, desperate, and it was everything she had been craving. The kiss deepened, igniting something inside her that she couldn't control. She wanted him, needed him, and nothing else mattered. In that moment, all thoughts of Alan, of right and wrong, disappeared. There was only Ryan, and the intoxicating pull of his body against hers. The next morning, reality hit Susan like a freight train. She sat at the breakfast table, her hands trembling as she sipped her coffee, her mind reeling from what had happened the night before. She had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. She had betrayed her husband in the worst way possible, And yet, she couldn't bring herself to regret it. Ryan, on the other hand, was as calm as ever. He sat across from her, eating his breakfast as though nothing had changed, a small, knowing smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "It wasn't just a one-time thing," he said casually, his eyes locking onto hers. "You know that, don't you?" Susan's heart skipped a beat. She had hoped that they could pretend it had never happened, move on and forget the passion that had consumed them. But the look in Ryan's eyes told her that wouldn't be possible. And deep down, she didn't want it to be. Days turned into weeks, and Susan found herself falling deeper into the affair. She couldn't resist Ryan, his presence, his touch. Every time they were alone, she felt the same overwhelming desire that had gripped her that first night. It was an addiction, one that she couldn't quit, even if she wanted to. But as her obsession with Ryan grew, so did her paranoia. She became increasingly possessive, watching his every move, her mind spiraling with thoughts of jealousy and fear. What if he didn't feel the same way? What if he left? What if someone found out? Susan's once perfect life began to unravel, her mind consumed by the affair. She started to distance herself from Alan, finding excuses to be alone with Ryan whenever possible. She couldn't think of anything else. Her entire world revolved around him now, and the thought of losing him terrified her. But there was more to come, something far darker than Susan could have ever imagined. Susan's life was no longer her own. Every moment she wasn't with Ryan was a moment spent thinking about him, longing for him. She had once been in control of her world, the perfect wife in the perfect town, but now that facade was crumbling. And yet, she didn't care. Nothing mattered anymore except Ryan. But with that obsession came fear that it could all be ripped away from her in an instant. She became more cautious, more secretive, though the desire inside her was growing harder to hide. She found herself stealing glances at Ryan during family dinners, her thoughts wandering as Alan droned on about work. What would Alan think if he knew what had happened, what was still happening? The thought sent a thrill down her spine, but it also terrified her. Ryan, on the other hand, seemed unaffected. He acted as though nothing had changed between them in public, maintaining his calm, composed demeanor. But when they were alone, it was a different story. He wanted her just as much as she wanted him, and their time together was becoming more dangerous, more reckless. One afternoon, while Alan was working late, Susan and Ryan found themselves in the kitchen, their bodies tangled together in a moment of passion when the doorbell rang. It was Alan, home earlier than expected. Susan's heart nearly stopped as she scrambled to straighten her clothes, her mind racing with panic. Ryan, however, remained calm, his lips curling into a smirk as he leaned down to whisper, "See? It's exciting, isn't it?" But the thrill was quickly turning into something darker for Susan. She couldn't stand the thought of losing him, couldn't bear the idea of their affair ending. And the more she thought about it, the more she realized what stood in their way. Alan. He was the only thing keeping them from being together, truly together. Without Alan, she and Ryan could be free to love each other without guilt, without fear. The thought started as a whisper in the back of her mind, but as the days went on, it grew louder and louder until it was all she could think about. One evening, after another failed attempt to push Ryan away, Susan found herself staring out the window, her mind racing. She couldn't do it anymore. She couldn't go on living this double life, pretending to be the perfect wife while her heart and body belonged to someone else. She needed a way out. And then, almost as if a switch had flipped in her mind, the answer became clear. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about Ryan. He had become distant lately, more aloof, and it terrified her. What if he was pulling away? What if he decided that this affair wasn't worth the risk anymore? The thought gnawed at her, eating away at the remnants of her sanity. She had to make sure Ryan stayed with her, had to prove that she was willing to do anything for him. The secrets between them were just beginning to surface. The next time they were alone, Susan brought it up. Her voice was soft but firm. Her eyes locked onto Ryan's as she spoke. "We could be together," she said, her fingers tracing the edge of the table nervously. No more sneaking around, no more secrets. Ryan raised an eyebrow, leaning back in his chair. What are you saying? I'm saying... She hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. I'm saying we don't have to live like this anymore, Alan. He's the only thing standing in our way. If he was gone... Ryan's eyes darkened as he stood abruptly, cutting her off. Susan, don't. Ryan's voice was sharp, his jaw clenched. You're talking crazy. But she wasn't crazy, at least she didn't think she was. She was just in love, deeply, madly in love with Ryan. And love made people do things they wouldn't normally do. It made them fight for what they wanted, no matter the cost. Susan wasn't crazy, she was just willing to do whatever it took to keep Ryan by her side. Still, Ryan shook his head, walking away from her. This has gone too far, he muttered. I can't... He stopped himself, his hands running through his hair in frustration. You need to stop talking like this, Susan. This isn't a game. Susan's heart sank as she watched him walk away, her mind spiraling. He didn't understand. He didn't see what she saw, the future they could have together. And if he didn't want to help her make it happen, she'd have to take matters into her own hands. The next few days passed in a blur of anxious thoughts and restless nights. Susan's mind was a storm, constantly churning with the same thought. Alan needed to be gone. She found herself rehearsing the conversation over and over, trying to make sense of her own twisted logic. She had to protect her relationship with Ryan, and this was the only way. And then, the perfect opportunity presented itself. Alan was leaving for a work trip, another late-night drive across state lines. He was always careful, always precise, but everyone had their weaknesses. As Alan packed his bags that night, Susan watched him closely, her mind racing. She knew the road he'd be taking, knew the dangerous stretch of highway where accidents weren't uncommon. That night, after Alan left, Susan paced the living room, her hands shaking. It was now or never. She couldn't back out now. She needed to make a call, an anonymous tip to the local authorities about a reckless driver on the highway. She could frame it perfectly, make it look like Alan had been the one at fault. No one would question it, but just as her fingers hovered over the phone, the front door swung open. Ryan stood there, his face pale, his eyes wild with fear. He had seen it. He had seen what she was about to do. "What the hell are you doing?" he demanded, his voice shaking with disbelief. Susan stared at him, her breath catching in her throat. She had never seen Ryan like this, so angry, so terrified. "I was doing this for us," she whispered, her voice trembling. "For us, Ryan." "No, Susan," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, his eyes wide with horror. "This isn't love. This is something else." And in that moment, everything shattered. Ryan's eyes were wide with disbelief as he stared at Susan, his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. The realization of what she was about to do hit him like a train. His words hung in the air between them, accusing, disbelieving. Susan stood frozen, the phone still in her trembling hand, her mind racing. She had done everything for him, everything to keep him close, and now he was looking at her like she was the one who had gone too far. But hadn't he seen it? Didn't he know she couldn't lose him? "Ryan, you don't understand," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I did this for us. For you." Ryan's hands shot to his head, raking through his hair in frustration. "No, Susan, this is insane. You can't just get rid of him. That's not how this works." "I had to." Susan's voice broke as she took a step toward him, her eyes wild with desperation. "Don't you see? He's the only thing standing in our way. We could be free to love each other the way we should." Ryan backed away, his movements sharp, deliberate. He no longer looked at her the way he used to. There was no warmth, no desire in his eyes, only fear. "Free? Susan, this isn't love. This is something else." His words cut deep, but the deeper they went, the more Susan resisted their truth. She couldn't accept that everything she had done, everything she had risked, had all been for nothing. Susan shook her head, her fingers digging into the phone. "You don't mean that. You love me, Ryan. You said you loved me." "I did," Ryan whispered, his voice pained. "But I don't know who you are anymore." Susan's heart dropped into her stomach, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. The weight of his words crushed her, but a part of her refused to let go. She couldn't. She wouldn't. Not now. "You're scared," she whispered, her voice softening as she took another step toward him. "That's all this is. You're scared of what we can have, but you don't have to be. I've taken care of everything." "No," Ryan snapped, his tone sharp. "You haven't taken care of anything. You've just made everything worse." The air between them felt thick and suffocating. Susan's chest tightened, her vision narrowing as her world crumbled around her. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Ryan was supposed to understand. He was supposed to see that she had done all of this for him. For them. "I can fix this," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "We can still be together." But Ryan's expression was hard, unyielding. "There's nothing to fix, Susan. This us. It was a mistake." His words were like knives, slicing through her heart with a vicious precision. A mistake? How could he say that? How could he just walk away from everything they had? "No," she whispered, shaking her head violently. "No, it wasn't a mistake. You love me, Ryan. You said you loved me." But Ryan's face remained cold. "I can't do this anymore." And with that, he turned toward the door, his back to her, his body tensed as if he couldn't get away fast enough. It was then that something snapped inside Susan. The pressure of months of secrecy, the constant fear of being caught, and the overwhelming desire to keep Ryan to herself all converged in a single blinding moment of fury. She couldn't let him leave. Not now, not ever. Before she even realized what she was doing, her hand shot out, grabbing the heavy glass vase from the nearby table. The weight of it felt solid, reassuring in her grip as she watched Ryan's retreating form. He couldn't leave. He couldn't leave her like this. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she raised the vase above her head, her body moving as if on autopilot. Everything seemed to slow down, her vision tunneling as the world narrowed to a single point. Ryan's back, vulnerable, unaware. And then with a sickening thud, she brought the vase down on his head. The sound of the impact was deafening, a hollow crack that echoed through the house. Ryan staggered forward, a groan escaping his lips as he crumpled to the floor. The vase slipped from Susan's hand, shattering on the hardwood, but she barely registered the sound. All she could see was Ryan, lying there, motionless, blood pooling around his head. For a moment, everything went silent. The world seemed to hold its breath, the enormity of what she had just done sinking in like a slow, creeping poison. Susan dropped to her knees beside him, her hands trembling as she reached out to touch his face. "Ryan?" she whispered, her voice shaking. "Ryan, wake up." But he didn't move. His chest didn't rise, his eyes didn't flutter open. He was gone. No. Susan's voice was barely a whisper now, her hands shaking as she shook his shoulder, desperately willing him to wake up. "Ryan, please, I didn't mean to. I didn't..." But it was too late. He was gone. The weight of what she had done crashed over her, suffocating her as she cradled Ryan's lifeless body in her arms. How did it come to this? How had everything spiraled so far out of control? She had done it for him, for them. But now she was alone. For what felt like hours, Susan knelt there, her mind a blur of disbelief and horror. The blood on her hands felt cold, sticky, but she couldn't bring herself to move. She couldn't let go of him. She couldn't let go of the only person she had ever truly loved. In the days that followed, the town of Oakwood was rocked by the sudden death of Ryan Carmichael. The official report deemed it an accident, a tragic fall that had resulted in a fatal head injury. There were no witnesses, and Susan, grief-stricken and inconsolable, played the part of the devastated stepmother perfectly. The funeral was a small, quiet affair attended by close family and friends. Alan stood by Susan's side, his hand resting gently on her back as she wept over Ryan's grave. She'd managed to avoid suspicion, her story meticulously crafted to cover her tracks. And yet, as the days turned into weeks, Susan found herself haunted by the weight of her actions. She couldn't escape the memory of that night, of the way Ryan's body had crumpled to the floor, of the sound of his skull cracking beneath the weight of the vase. The image played over and over in her mind, relentless, inescapable. At first, she tried to bury it, to lock the memory away in the deepest recesses of her mind. But it was no use. It was always there, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting to consume her. Alan, oblivious to the truth, remained a steadfast source of support. He never questioned the circumstances of Ryan's death, never once considered that his wife, the woman he had trusted with his heart, could have been responsible. He was blinded by his grief, by his need to believe that the world still made sense. But Susan knew better. The world didn't make sense. Not anymore. Her obsession with Ryan hadn't died with him. If anything, it had only grown stronger. She found herself visiting his grave almost daily, bringing fresh flowers, whispering apologies into the wind as if he could somehow hear her. She couldn't let go. Not of him, not of the love she had felt for him. It had consumed her, driven her to madness, and now it was all she had left. One afternoon, as she knelt by Ryan's headstone, a familiar figure approached from behind. Susan didn't need to turn around to know who it was. "Alan," she whispered, her voice hoarse from crying. "I didn't hear you come up." Alan stood there for a moment, his expression unreadable as he looked down at his wife, her fragile form hunched over the grave. There was a long pause before he finally spoke. "I've been thinking, Susan," he said quietly, his voice filled with a heaviness that sent a chill down her spine. "About Ryan. About what happened." Susan froze, her heart skipping a beat as she slowly rose to her feet, turning to face him. There was something in his eyes, something dark, something that made her blood run cold. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice trembling. Alan took a step closer, his gaze never leaving hers. "I know you've been struggling, Susan. I know how much you loved him." Susan's breath caught in her throat, her pulse quickening as she took a step back. "I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered, her mind racing. But Alan didn't stop. He kept walking toward her, his expression hard, unyielding. "I know about the affair, Susan." Her world came crashing down in that instant. She had been so careful, so meticulous in covering her tracks. Alan's words lingered in the air like a final judgment, sinking into Susan's skin, chilling her to the bone. The wind whistled through the cemetery, rustling the trees as if the very world was conspiring to make her feel small, insignificant, against the magnitude of what she had done. Alan, her once doting husband, the man she had deceived so thoroughly, stood before her like a cold executioner. The way he looked at her now, there was no hint of the love that had once defined their marriage. Susan's pulse thudded in her ears. Her mind raced, grasping for any thread of an excuse, any explanation that might somehow lessen the weight of her guilt. But nothing came. She was hollow, drained, because she knew deep down that there was nothing she could say to fix this. She had crossed the line, not just with Ryan, but with herself. I never meant for it to go this far," Susan stammered, her voice a broken whisper, barely audible against the backdrop of the wind. Alan's eyes darkened, his lips curling into a humorless smile. "Did you ever think about how far it would go, Susan? Or did you just lose yourself in the fantasy?" The words cut deep, sharper than she'd expected. She had been trapped in a fantasy, hadn't she? Ryan was her escape, her obsession, her reckless desire to feel alive again. And in pursuing that desire, she had thrown away everything. Her marriage, her sanity, and now her future. "I loved him, Alan," she blurted out, her voice cracking. "I loved him in a way I couldn't love you anymore." Alan flinched, but the look of pain quickly faded, replaced with cold detachment. "You think that makes any of this better? He was my son, Susan, my son. And you destroyed him. You destroyed us." Tears welled up in her eyes, but they brought no relief. The weight of Alan's words bore down on her. crushing her beneath the enormity of her betrayal. She had destroyed them all, she realized. Ryan, Alan herself, none of them had escaped the ruin that her obsession had wrought. "I didn't mean for it to happen like this," she said, almost pleading. "I didn't want to hurt him. I didn't want to hurt you." "But you did," Alan replied, his voice colder than ever. "You hurt all of us. And now you have to live with that." The silence that followed was deafening, as if the entire world had held its breath. Susan wanted to scream, to plead for forgiveness, to explain that she had only been searching for something more, something to fill the void that had grown inside her over the years. But none of that would matter now. Alan's eyes told her everything. He didn't care why. He only cared that it was done. Alan's expression was unreadable as he stepped back, his gaze lingering on her for a moment longer before he turned and walked away. He didn't look back. There was no need to. He had said everything he needed to say, and there was nothing more for him here. Susan stood alone by Ryan's grave, her entire body trembling as the reality of what she had done finally settled in. She had loved Ryan, loved him so much that she had killed for him. But now, as she stared down at the freshly turned earth that marked his final resting place, she realized just how far that love had driven her into madness. She had lost everything. Alan would never forgive her, and Ryan was gone, taken by her own hand in a moment of uncontrollable desperation. There was nothing left for her now. Nothing but the empty, hollow ache of regret that gnawed at her insides like a disease. Susan sank to her knees beside Ryan's grave, her tears falling freely now. "I'm sorry," she whispered, though she knew no one was listening. "I'm so sorry." But the wind carried her words away, scattering them into the void as if they had never been spoken at all. And in that moment, Susan realized that this was her punishment. Not prison, not judgment from others, but the knowledge that she would have to live with the consequences of her obsession for the rest of her life. In the end, Susan Carmichael was left to face the devastating consequences of her actions. Her obsession had torn apart a family, and a once peaceful town would forever remember the tragic events that unfolded. The affair, the lies, and the murder left a trail of destruction that no one could have predicted. Now, the quiet town of Oakwood is left with the haunting memory of how far a forbidden love can go, and the irreversible damage it leaves behind.